Hey everybody, this is Dr. Flight. I hope you're doing well today. This is a video that will focus on different influences that impact consumers as they are making a purchase decision. In earlier videos, you learned about a decision-making process which is made up of 5 distinct stages. It starts with need recognition and progresses all the way through to post-purchase evaluation. Now, those steps have been well researched and developed, and as marketers, we want to understand how people make decisions, but also that process of making a decision can be influenced by a number of different factors. So we're going to look at some of those factors in this video, and specifically, there are going to be 3 broad areas that we look at. One of which is psychological, and it has to do with how we think and view the purchase environment and kind of the psychological aspects that go into modifying our decision-making process from person to person. There'll be social factors, which include family and reference groups and things like culture. And then finally, situational impacts or influences that do play a role in how we make decisions. So again, we have a decision-making process, but we understand layered on top of that are elements that impact whether we make a decision well or the degree to which we use the process to make a decision. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's just jump right in, talk about psychological factors. And when I talk about these, keep in mind that a big component of marketing is the study of how consumers make buying decisions. So we call that consumer behavior. And much of that has to do with psychological analysis and theory coming from psychology and also sociology. So those are 2 fields of study that have contributed enormously to our understanding of how consumers make purchase decisions. So we're going to talk about a couple of those today. We won't be able to go into enormous depths, but you can get a feel for how these would influence a decision to buy a product. So the first thing we'll talk about is a concept called involvement. Involvement is, and when we use it in terms of buying like this, it's a level or degree of mental engagement that the customer has in the process. So when you're heavily involved, it means you're thinking a lot and really, really concentrating on the issue or the topic at hand. If you're not involved, if you have low involvement, then it means that the issue or the topic isn't something you're really putting a lot of forceful effort or thought into. So a theory then that uses the idea of involvement is called the elaboration likelihood model. It's actually a model that's built on a couple different theories. And in the model, basically what's happening is when you process information, you can think heavily on it using high involvement. And if we did that, it would be called taking the peripheral approach or taking the high involvement approach rather with deep processing to analyze a problem. When you make big purchase decisions, when you spend a lot of money for a product or you make a purchase that it's a rare purchase that you only might make once in a while, typically you use a lot of high involvement thinking to do that. The other type of thinking would be low involvement, and this is peripheral processing. That's as opposed to deeper direct processing. Peripheral processing happens when you don't put a lot of mental effort into the decision. So products that you buy every day, products that you'd think would be routine or that are very easy to understand, that aren't very technologically complex, those are products that we would typically buy using a low involvement process. Oftentimes, when we talk about elaboration likelihood model, we're talking about communication, and we're talking about information or message processing. So when we think. So if you see an advertisement that has a lot of information that you have to think a lot about, the ad is forcing you to take a direct route of processing that's high involvement. If the advertisement doesn't have a lot of information, or maybe it's using a humor appeal, it's just kind of lighthearted and just kind of wants you to know the brand. If you don't think a lot about the ad and what's being asked of you, then that's a peripheral route form of processing that information. That's kind of what's being tapped into. Okay, so understand the concept of involvement and how it plays a role in the elaboration likelihood model. All right, next we'll talk about motives. So oftentimes we want to understand why people buy. We understand that they have a need, but they choose a specific product for a reason. And oftentimes it's to meet a need they have based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that's what's depicted here in the pyramid. Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that there are certain needs that people satisfy first. Then once those needs are met, and those tend to be physiological needs, so those are safety needs, those are basic living needs. After that, people want to feel safe and secure. Then they want to have relationships with others. They want to then feel good about themselves. And then finally, they want to meet long-term goals and aspirations. They want to achieve long-term goals and aspirations. Now, do they have to achieve long-term goals and aspirations to survive? No, absolutely not. Do you have to feel good about yourself to survive? Nope. You don't need that. You don't need relationships either. And so the point here is that in Maslow's hierarchy, the theory of this hierarchy says that we are motivated first by physical needs. Once those physical needs are met, then we can move on to other needs, which are important but less important, and those would be needs of safety and security. Then followed by that, needs that are associated with relationships and interactions with others. And then finally, internal needs that deal with my self-esteem, my feeling good about myself, my point of consciousness, and then finally aspirations. So motives then are hierarchical. Again, we often want to know what's motivating a customer to buy. That's the most important thing we can probably know, and this is one tool we use to do it. Okay, other psychological factors, and there's going to be 3 or 4 of these that we can look at, one of which is attitude. We talk about attitude, we talk about somebody's feelings towards something. Feelings or attitudes tend to lead to behavior. So if you feel good about something, you tend to gravitate towards it. If you like something, you gravitate towards it. So attitudes tend to be, these evaluations that you've had or experienced with a product, and you feel maybe positive or negative towards it. So we can categorize attitudes into kind of 3 different sort of outcomes or spaces. One would be a cognitive thing, where an attitude reflects our belief system. In other words, our attitudes might be impacted by some type of thing we mentally know to be true. And that would be a cognitive formed attitude that you have. Another may be emotional, and we sometimes call this affective. So an emotional attitude is one where, again, we had this. There's actually a scale called positive affect, negative affect, PANA for short, where we measure people's emotional, are they positively affective, are they positively inclined, or negatively inclined. So other than a belief system that drives your attitude towards something, You might have an emotional component that drives yourself to something else. And then the last one is behavior. Sometimes behavior is based on or a result of our feelings. And also sometimes we don't have feelings or an attitude towards something until we do behave. Sometimes you don't have an attitude until you experience something. And so that's something that we call an experiential good, where you don't really know what to think about it until after you have experienced it. Right? So attitude is another psychological thing that we want to measure. We often do this in marketing where we measure attitudes of our customers. Pull down a couple more here. We have a perception. So when we perceive something, it's how we internalize what we see. So we can see a product, we can experience a product, and our perception of that product is formed over time based on the experience that we have, or in a meaningful way, how we view reality in the world around us. Learning, memory are kind of tied into this. So past experiences give us a basis for understanding. We know that in the decision-making process, we experience a need. If we've already satisfied that need in the past, then we tap into learning and memory and our internal sources of information in order to enhance the decision-making process. So remember, all of these, again, are psychological factors that influence the decision-making process. Last thing we'll look at, or we'll just mention here, is lifestyle. So lifestyle is a reflection of your personality and things you're interested in. Lifestyle can be directed by how much money you make or your job you have, your friends that you hang out with. It can be impacted by a number of different elements, but it often is triggered by or an extension of your personality, which is a psychological element. You may also think of personality as being tied into a culture, but that's a little bit of a different category. That actually falls under social factors, which we're moving to next. So social factors are the elements, and remember I mentioned that we draw a lot of our work from sociology. So we just talked about psychology, but sociology is the study of people and how people live and work and such together. Think of how much impact your family has, or your family unit, your parents or your siblings or your grandparents or people who take care of you. They all have a big impact on helping you form your consumption patterns. And so oftentimes families as a cohesive unit, obviously they live together, but they often learn together too and learn to function kind of in the world around them. So, if I have a need that needs to be filled, maybe we have a need that needs to be filled together as a joint unit, and we learn together how that should be done. So family role modeling is a big deal on how people consume and ultimately how we make decisions. So we learn oftentimes how we make decisions from those strong role models who were family members at one point. Okay, another social factor that we want to talk a little bit about would be something called a reference group. Now, in research, there's tons and tons and tons of research done on reference groups and the influence of reference groups. There are ideas of being in a group and out of a group, and there's ideas of all the roles that reference groups play in a person's life. And when we talk about reference groups, we're talking about a group of people who have something in common, where they share a commonality and they form a bond together. You may remember in school being part of a group of friends, and you sort of learned from each other and you mimicked each other. And if one of your friends started wearing a new fashion, maybe others in the friend group would wear that new fashion. And they would influence each other, right? You'd influence and be influenced and influence others who are in your friend group. So that might be thought of as a reference group. So groups of people, groups of individuals who come together to share a commonality, and in doing so, they form similar consumption patterns, right? So being part of a reference group adds a lot of personal affirmation. It adds a lot of self-respect. It gives you the feeling that you're part of something, right? You're part of a group. And that makes you feel good. And as a result, you tend to, again, reflect each other's purchase consumption patterns and things like that. And so reference groups, that's something to remember. Finally, here when we talk about social factors, we can mention a bit about culture. Culture actually happens in a couple different areas, a couple different levels, I guess. You can have like a broad national culture, or you can also have a local regional culture that has influence on you. But a culture is a group of people who possess a shared meaning, belief, moral system, values, and customs. So it's a group of people who share those things in common. Certainly, they would be similar to a reference group, except that they're larger, and sometimes they are driven by like religious aspects or nationality and some things like that. But in any rate, the culture that you grow up in is significant. One example is cultures that are individualistic versus cultures that are group or communal. So in the Far East, countries in the Far East and in Asia, people in those cultures are often communal, and they have a greater sense of family and community, whereas people in the West, in the Western Europe and in the United States and North America, they tend to be more individualistic, where they do things on their own, less community, less focus on communal aspects. That's a cultural thing. That's a cultural element that's worth spending a little time thinking about. Okay, so those are social factors. Finally, we're going to slide into situational factors, and then we'll finish up this video. When we talk about situational factors as influences on the decision-making process, we're talking about elements that are not necessarily internal. They're not necessarily part of you, but they're the context in which you're making a decision. They form the context in which you make a decision. So if you shop, for instance, with a friend, in here there's an italic sentence here: my best friend is having a birthday, so I'm buying a bracelet, which I hope they remember for a very long time. The context of this purchase is, one, you're buying a gift. Gift giving is a very important ritual in most cultures. So you're buying a gift. So the significance of this purchase based on gift giving is vital. You're buying it for a friend. It's not somebody who's just a random person. It's a close friend. And you hope that this gift has a long-term meaningful like element for that recipient. You hope that they remember it for a long time. So when you go to buy a gift for a friend who you hope remembers this gift for a long time, it's a very different situation than if you're going to buy groceries for the week or something mundane like that. So that's an example of kind of a situation that may form the context that influences how you choose to make a purchase decision. Other situational factors, some can be fabricated and some are just in the environment around us. So there are sensory elements that place a context around you for which you can make purchases. So this is actually a area of study where we call it atmospherics, like store or retail atmospherics is a study of the environment in the store. So it could include the layout of the store, the colors that are used, the music that's played, the scents that are spread through the air, the lighting, the mood lighting, all of the textures that are used within the store. Again, how the store is laid out in terms of where the products are displayed. All those things fall under store atmospherics, and they create the emotion, the sensory situation. So something to think about in terms of situational factors. The very last one, in terms of what we'll talk about today that could impact the buying decision, is time. Think back when you have to make a decision. Imagine when you make a decision and you have to make a decision quickly. Like you only have a very short period of time to make a complex decision. How much stress does that create for you, and how well do you handle that? Think about if you're making a decision that's going to impact you today versus an impact that's going to impact a decision that's going to impact you 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Those types of like time-related components play a role, right, in how we make decisions. So think about two different dimensions here: making decisions now versus later, and importantly, like when is the effect going to take place? I'm making a decision, is the effect of my decision going to be immediate, or is the effect of my decision going to be long term? And then finally, and second, making a decision in a compressed time environment. So making decisions quickly means you have to evaluate a situation fast. You have to go through the decision-making process quickly. You have to, you have to kind of figure things out. Whereas if you have more time, then you can, spread that decision-making process out over a long period of time. That would be another way to think of time influencing the decision-making process. Okay, so as we wrap this up, don't forget this idea of involvement and how involvement contributes to different paths of information processing. That's wrapped up in in the model, the elaboration likelihood model, ELM, it's sometimes referred to as. We have high and low involvement consumers, and again, it's the way we process information. And then we want to be able to describe different psychological factors that influence the decision-making process. Don't forget Maslow's hierarchy, which suggests motivation towards things. We have attitudes, we have beliefs, those types of things are thrown in there. We also have social factors, the influence of family, the influence of reference groups. These are important to remember. And then finally, we had some situational factors that suggested the purchase situation could be created by a retail environment, like in atmospherics, could be a function of time, something like that. But it's a situation or the context in which we find ourselves making a decision. Okay, so with that, we're wrapping up. Pause the video, make sure you can answer these questions and that you're comfortable with this material before moving on. And otherwise, have a great day. Thanks.